Yeah, I think that's okay. Good morning. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. There's an element of going back to the future in this room, I think, coming here with the toilet facilities and everything. But certainly also when you look at the car standing over here, there's definitely an element of the future. I want to start by taking you back some 40 years to the year that I was born, actually, 1973. Denmark was one of two countries most hard hit by the oil crisis in 73-74, along with Japan. 99% dependent on import of fossil fuels. At that time, oil, which pretty much hammered the Danish society. Car-free Sundays. I don't know if some of you actually will remember. Some of the PhD students are as young as I, and so they won't remember. But it pretty much changed the political landscape in Denmark because all of a sudden we didn't have the energy that we needed in society. So we needed to do something different. We needed to step up to the plate. And so what was actually decided was out of a reason of energy security, security of supply. We decided to diversify. We decided to search more intensively for oil and gas in the North Sea. We also decided to start some experimental projects on wind. We decided to go into biomass, incineration, and so forth. Many technologies were spurred by this catastrophic event for the Danish economy. And so I think the bottom line here is energy security and economic reasoning. That has taken us on a very, very long trip to where we are today. The first 20 years, independence from oil. The past 20 years have been also about independence of fossil fuels, also about economic rationale, but certainly also about establishing a base for clean energy, clean environment, CO2 emission reductions, and yet still cost effectiveness. We have just last month at the EU level reached agreement after some very, very tough negotiations at the European Council on a 2030 package of targets, 3 overall targets. We might have wanted them to be a little more ambitious, certainly on the renewables target, but we now have a target of at least 40% reduction of CO2 emissions compared to 1990 in 2030. We have a binding target at the EU level for renewables of 27%, and we have an indicative target for energy efficiency of 27%. The 27% efficiency is actually not that bad when you start calculating what the EU has actually done over the past years and what is then to come. But what we would like to see is that these binding targets were disaggregated to the national level. That's not likely to happen. So what we'll have to do now is we'll have to work within this context to actually make them bind for the various countries. We did that with the energy efficiency target in the current period with the Energy Efficiency Directive, which we negotiated during the Danish EU presidency. We actually managed to get some tools in place that were binding at the national level, so countries have to live up to that, even though the target in this period is indicative. So we think that we can work with these targets. We think we can continue the current development that we're seeing in the EU, and we think that for the market this is an extremely important set of targets because it actually makes for investment, it makes for investment security. Now the EU level is of course the most important when it comes to framework setting and policy and regulatory development, but we also do have national targets. And this is very contested because what does it mean to have a national CO2 target when we have an ETS system, which basically means that when we invest within the ETS in Denmark, it's something that's more than our commitment at the EU level. It just means that somebody in the south of Europe can invest less. So there's a political debate about that. What we're saying and what the political level is saying basically we need to continue to drive development in Denmark, and since we're so far ahead already, we need to keep pushing the limits. And so that's the basic reason for having national targets. But there's also, of course, political reasoning. So we want to be ahead. We want to be leading this change at the global level. And so we have set up with the Danish energy policy and with the government's positions, we've set up some very clear targets for 2030, 2035 and 2050. 2030 is a very clear target of no coal in the Danish power plants. 2035 is a little more challenging, actually, because what we're saying there is that all electricity and heating will have to come completely from renewable sources. Now, we do have a gas system in Denmark, which was a quite large investment. And so to take out natural gas of the equation in 2035 is something that will be very, very challenging. We'll come back to that also in maybe the Q&A session. But I think we need to work with the definition of complete fossil-free electricity and heating production in 2035 to make sure that we don't strand assets in the gas system. In 2050, 100% renewables in all sectors, including transport. So that's a very clear target, but it's also quite far away, and yet, in terms of energy investments, it's not that far away. What has helped us tremendously in Denmark in achieving the targets that we've set so far is the connections that we have to our neighboring countries. The fact that we're part of a very well-functioning day-to-day, intraday market system for electricity trading in the northern, actually not only in the Nordic countries, now we also have connections to Germany. We will have connections to the Netherlands very soon. We're contemplating a connection to the UK. I don't think that we'll have more connections to Norway in the near term because others are courting the Norwegians right now. Others have seen that the hydro supplies that they can provide to an electricity market that's becoming more and more unstable due to renewables is actually something that's high priced. And the Norwegians are not thinking of increasing their hydro capacity. So we used to have a very, very easy access to the Norwegian hydro supplies, but we don't anymore. So that's a challenge, but we then do have other options in the books. But what we have gained from this is, of course, that the build-out of renewables in Denmark has been possible, because the fact that these are fluctuating sources have not been that big of a challenge because of the connections we have to, in particular, Norway. The way we do, and this may not be new to you, the way that we come about these targets in Denmark is the political process is maybe not that creative, quite simple. We tend to do very particular, very deep analysis of the next phase. So what is it that we need to get to 2020? Say, what is it we need if we are to reach a 40% CO2 target in 2020? So we do analysis of various parts of this equation, and we come up with solutions for the politicians. We say, okay, if you want to reach 40% CO2 reductions, you need to place 2 large-scale offshore wind parks within this time frame. You need to work with tax incentives for power plants within this framework, and so forth. We simply come up with a toolbox for the politicians and say, you want this target, here's what you have to do. But then we also say, going forward to the next phase, 2030, where you may set this target, because basically if you want a linear phase-in, then which would be relevant in economic terms, then here's where you want to be, and that would require this and this. But there's a number of questions that we have, and which we don't have answers for. So what we will do, while you agree to this, then you should also agree to letting us work on these things. And this is where iPower comes in. This is where other projects come in to sort of figure out what it is that we should do, how we should do it, how we should go about reaching the targets. So we go into it's a process of analysis, decisions, analysis and decisions. And this makes the politicians quite comfortable, that we actually have, one, a good idea of what the costs will be and what the solutions are, but also that we have the right questions set for the next phase of analysis. So what I think we've established with this political process, or this logic of political decision making, is that we have established a level of comfort among politicians in Denmark, which is actually quite high. And this is also the signal that we get from our interactions with the Chinese, for instance. They kind of like our way of doing things. And so they have picked it up in their decision-making process. They are doing energy analysis in the same way that we are. It has also made for a very broad consensus in the Danish political landscape. So the fact is that actually right now we have 95% of parliament backing the Danish energy policy, even with the blips on the radar that we had this summer. So I think this is actually a very good story to tell. We have just this spring finalized, actually we did it last winter, but we weren't allowed to publish it before the end of the spring for political reasons. We have finalized 4 analyses of what an energy system might look like in 2050. One of them is a biomass-based scenario. There's a lot of wind in that as well, because Denmark is very prone to very good wind conditions. But it's a biomass-based scenario which would require a lot of import of biomass in the 2050 time frame. There's a BioPlus scenario which is even further out that direction. There's a wind scenario which is to a very, very high degree dependent on wind production. And this is where you may have seen the minister come out saying that he wanted one big wind turbine every week until 2050. That's sort of along the lines of the wind scenario. Not quite, but he wanted to make a political statement, which is quite fine. We have an election year next year, so. But the wind scenario would require massive investment in wind power. And there's a hydrogen scenario, which is wind and hydrogen in combination. And then we have also what you might call sort of I wouldn't say a baseline scenario, but a fossil scenario to compare these renewable scenarios to. This is not relevant because this wouldn't even meet the 2020 targets that we have set up in the Danish context, so and in the EU context for that matter. So it's just basically to say what is sort of the reference point for our development of these, in economic terms, what would be the reference point for these renewable scenarios. And the fact is that the extra costs of these renewable scenarios, as we see it now in 2014, is quite limited. So what we can say basically is, through these scenarios where we actually we reach the CO2 targets that we have set for the Danish society and for the EU. We continue to have energy security, security of energy supply. We do it in a cost-effective manner with known technologies. The extra cost of that in 2014, calculating from 2014, is actually dismal. So I think that's actually a very good conclusion at this point. Things will change, things will develop. I'm sure that the cost will come down. So we're looking at something that is actually I would say, a win-win situation. What is not so much of a win-win situation, and this is also where you come in with your project here, is that even if we manage to change demand in the system, demand response factors come in heavily. Even if we establish a system where we can balance the fluctuating energy sources, we're still looking at something where we will have a need for imports, and imports being the sort of beige gray area here in parts of a week. So we won't end up in a situation where we can control this all by ourselves. We will be very much dependent on our neighbors, and that's also what we're working. That's the working thesis we have at the European level right now. We see countries like the UK and France establishing capacity markets for their utilities. We see Germany thinking about doing the same thing, which is an instrument that will take us away from integration because it's establishing national markets. This is not a good thing, and so what we're working with the Germans and the Commission on right now is instruments that can bring us towards an integrated market, because everybody will need this in 2050. Everybody will need this on the way to 2050. And the challenge here is, of course, that energy is still seen as very much of a national thing. It's security of supply for the national consumers, for the national industries, and not so much something that you're seeing as something that where you can all gain from integration. We need to secure our own. We've seen that with the Germans over the past years. As the only country that we're connected to, is that when they have a balancing problem in Germany, they turn down the capacity in the cables to Denmark. And so when I'm saying this to the German State Secretary, he says, well, I haven't heard that. That's nonsense, but it's a fact. And so what we need to work with is a market that's not only integrated, but where capacity flows to where the price is highest at all times, no matter what the capacity needs are in a single country. And that takes a lot of regulatory development at the European level, and that's what we're engaging in. Now, demand and response, just to be absolutely clear, demand and response is a key measure in establishing an energy market in the future where it's possible to balance production with demand. But it's not an instrument or a tool that will bring us all the way, not even close. It's below 10% in our calculations of what's needed. So we will need this, and we'll need this certainly at the company levels for big industry in the first place. We'll need consumers to come online later on. But just to say that we need to do other things as well. We need better connections to our neighboring countries. We need to work with storage to a much larger extent than we are today. This is what we're looking at. It's not very pretty, but there's a lot of arrows going back and forth. This is the energy system in 2050. Completely fossil-free, completely renewables-based. We have the wind turbines in the upper left corner, along with the sun, which is always a pain in my eyes these years. We have the refineries, like Morbia Energy Concept, over in the middle to the left. We have wood chips coming into the combined heat and power, along with garbage in the bottom left. And out of all of these connections between these various parts of the energy system, along with storage and as I mentioned before, the natural gas grid, which is, I think, will continue to be a balancing source in the system for many years to come. Out of this, we get the energy that we need for heating, for process energy, for kinetic energy, and for power. And as you see at the top, the interconnectors are there to the countries around us. What we did a few years ago was we established, along with the Danish energy, Dansk Energi, we established a smart grid network to basically answer the question, how can we encompass 50% of fluctuating power in our power system in 2020? This was sort of a co-creation process because it involved all stakeholders, 70 plus, I think, in Danish society. And a number of very, very good ideas sprung from that, which have changed regulation, changed our political decision-making in a number of ways in the following years. So I think this was a political success. I think it was a success for the Danish society that we were able to work together among stakeholders across the energy sector to come up with solutions and ideas for analysis, further analysis, that have actually produced results already. We're now taking this a step further. And we have just last week launched, along with Dansk Energi and others, launched a new partnership, the Smart Energy Partnership, which will take us from the electricity and power system over to the entire energy system. So now from looking at the electricity perspective of things, we're now looking at the entire energy system. We're looking at integration among the different parts of the energy system. From storage to refineries to combined heat and power. How will this fit in with the power grid? How can we use district heating as a storage and so forth? There's a number of opportunities that we have to sort of chew and figure out how we can gain most value from. What we have a very strong focus on at the Danish Energy Agency is making sure that the regulatory changes we make come at the right time and in the right sort of conditions, so that we don't over-regulate, so that we don't come in with regulation too early or too late. The problem with this is that the Danish energy regulation, and this probably goes for many countries, is so extremely complex and so interlinked that if we change things in one part of the system, it has massive effects in other parts of the system. And the fact is that, and I have to be honest, we don't always know what the effects will be in all parts of the system. This is how complex things are. So what we need to do in the coming years is we need to clean up regulation very much. And we need to establish a regulation that is very much based on incentives, economic incentives for change. So we need to incentivize through our regulation the change that we want to see. So what I think, if we go back again 40 years, is we've come from, and I have other slides, but not in this presentation, which are very figurative. We've come from a planning, a national, very sort of closed box planning logic, where we could plan the power system, we could plan the gas system, we could plan the heating system, the district heating system, and so forth. We've come from that logic into a logic that is completely linked to our neighboring countries, to Europe, an international logic of price setting, where what we do in Denmark is very much affected by our neighbors. So this is a market logic, if you will. It's still an infrastructure sector, so there's an element of natural monopoly in part of this, but it's an economic logic. It's a market-based system basically, and we have to change our regulation to fit with that. So basically, to sum up, and I don't know if this really sums it up, but the long-term perspective is clear. These targets are still so far away that we can say, okay, that's fine, we'll reach that. But the problem is that the midterm targets, the 2020 targets and 2035 targets, are in this sector very, very close. And so we have to come up with solutions, if not right now, then in the coming years, certainly. And right after 2020, we think that the politicians need to decide on one of the four scenarios. Which scenario do they want to pick? Is it going to be the bio scenario, the bio plus scenario, the wind scenario, or the hydrogen scenario? My bet right now is on some sort of a scenario that's shaped over the wind scenario. That's where I think we're going. But that also depends on the political game and where and who's in charge and whether it's Venstre or the current government, but that remains to be seen. There will be parts of the system that, of course, that bio will be part of the system even in a wind scenario to a very large degree. But the fact is that we can supply ourselves with the biomass that we need in the wind scenario, whereas we need imports in the bio scenario. So, right. I don't need to say how we work with these things through taxes, economic regulation, testing, so forth. There's a number of elements. But what I want to say is that right now we've set down an intergovernmental commission or group, working group among the ministries of taxation, finance, and ourselves, that looks at the entire tax and subsidies regime in Denmark. And the basic question there asked us to come up with suggestions on how we can shape this system better to make sure that we establish the right incentives for the change that we want to see. That's what I wanted to say. So now I think we have 20 minutes for Q&A. Yeah?
Thank you. Yes, I was gonna thank you for this Danish perspective. It's nice to be summed up of what's happening right now in Denmark. So thank you very much. So 20 minutes for questions. Who want to? Yes, please.
Olaf Bertelsen from CSNV. How do you figure we can prevent the export price when we are forced to export wind power, the export price to be very low, and the import price when we are forced to import power to be very high in Denmark?
Well, I think we're looking at the market model right now to make sure that we are creating the right market conditions for import and export also on both for supply and demand in the Danish system. And we're doing that with Energinet.dk. I don't know if this is on, but you can hear me without it, can't you? So I'll take it off. No, it's on? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, but the fact is that when there's a large supply of something and there's a low demand, then the price goes down. So that's how the market works. And so I think what's important about this discussion is to say that we're not exporting our wind energy at zero. We're exporting at the price of the Norwegian market, for instance. What's the difference between the market price in Denmark and the market price in Norway goes into the pockets of the Danish consumers through Energinet.dk and through the flaskehalsindtægt. I don't know what the English word for that is. But so it's redistributed back to the Danish consumers. So you can't say that there's a price in Denmark of zero and there's a price in Norway of 40 øre, for instance. And so we are basically exporting at zero. That's not the whole truth. So I think we can work better to make sure that we establish a closer link between demand and response, or between supply and demand, but to minimize the gap. But the fact of the matter is that when there's a limited demand in Norway and a high supply in Denmark, then the price will be lower, for sure.
Michael Dulfer, Merge One Group. You mentioned the secret reports. Are they now released for public view? That's the first question. I mean, you said the political stuff for 2050. The other thing you mentioned were you had discussion with China in terms of those, let's name them measurements of energy in the future. Are this discussion with China a purpose of cooperation that you already have at this moment or in the future? Thank you.
I think the reports or the scenarios that I was talking to are the ones that we released before the summer break. So those are the 4 scenario reports for 2050. Those are on our website. There's no secrets about it. It was just secret until we released it. For political reasons, basically the problem was that there was a number of challenges in those scenarios. And the problem by releasing those, and for us to release those, would be that the mic would be in the face of the minister saying, how are you going to deal with these challenges? And since he didn't have a mandate from government on how to answer these questions, it would be nonsense to release them. That's the basic fact of why they were secret for so long. And that was not because it was a challenging discussion, it was basically because there was a backlog in government on decision making. So a number of other issues were on top of the agenda before we could get to this one. So that's why it took some months to get there. On China, We've been courted by China for a number of years. And you probably meet that in your daily work. They're very interested in what we do on renewables, what we do on our grid, what we do on energy efficiency and so forth. Not only because we're doing some interesting stuff, but also because they see our societal model as some kind of perfect model. That's where they want to go. And so they're attracted to Denmark for several reasons. But it also attracts them to the energy sector. And we've been sort of internally battling with for years, how should we engage with China? Is this a challenge or a threat, or is this something that we should embrace? Basically because we see Danish companies struggling in the Chinese markets, because there's a number of ways that the Chinese are trying to limit the market access for foreigners. So the wind power companies have seen over the years up and downs, but basically seen that they've been challenged in the Chinese market. Fair enough, that's how it works. But it's been difficult for us to grasp how we should actually work with the Chinese. But I think 3 years ago we started interacting more aggressively with the Chinese government to see if we could learn from each other. Also for us to learn from the Chinese. Because there's a number of things that they're doing, and they're doing it at a larger scale, and they're doing it faster than we do. So we thought that it would be a win-win to work closer with the Chinese government. And one of the things that we realized was not only that we have something to offer the Chinese, but also that the way that we do our analysis, the way that we process the change in the Danish energy system is something that the Chinese liked very much and agreed to. This is also their sort of way of working political processes or large economic decision making. So on a number of fronts, we've seen that this very, very close bilateral cooperation has been fruitful not only for China, but certainly also for us. We've also seen Danish companies do very well in China over the past years. Danfoss has done very well in the north of China with combined heat and power and so forth. There's a number of big projects that have come online in China. So we think that this is a very, very good example of what bilateral cooperation can do to make this transition possible. And I won't take too much credit for the changes we see in China, but I think we have a little bit we're a little part of the success that they're making right now, and the very, very ambitious goals that they're setting. And last week we saw the goals that Obama and the Chinese president set up for 2050 and for the climate talks. And I think it was more ambitious on the Chinese side than it actually is on the American. But that remains to be seen in the final negotiations next year. Right.
Frank Ellison from the Danish Technological Institute. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. In iPower, we are working a lot on balancing the grid and addressing the flexibility on the consumption side. And you mentioned that you want to introduce some new incentives in the new regulatory framework. Could you tell a little bit more about what kind of incentives you are looking at to address especially the flexibility on the consumption side, because that's where we see some huge challenges in the future?
Yeah, well, basically we need to make sure that the price is right on electricity and at certain times. So basically, if we can change the tariff structure, that would be interesting. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. I can't tell you what the conclusions will be because that's for the spring to come. But that's certainly a big part of what we're looking at. Now the question is, when should we do this? Because when would be the right time to release this into the market system? And I don't know that we're there yet. I think the short-term challenge for us right now is that we're seeing the price of battery technology for installation in households dropping. We've seen the price of solar panels dropping. We've seen the heat pumps, price of heat pumps dropping. And so we're actually in a situation where in a few years it may be cost effective for my own household to actually decouple from the net and establish my own power system. And then I just need, there's different opinions about that, and that is also something we're looking at right now very closely, because that would be a big problem for the state's revenues if that were to happen. So we need to also look there at the tariff structure and what it actually costs to connect to the grid, because if I were to do that privately, and anybody were to do that privately, we would still need a sort of safe line to the net for energy security reasons in our households. So how do we price set that? But that's a more immediate challenge, I think, than the challenge of making sure that we have the tariff structure that fits demand response in the private households. I think what we're looking at now is still company level, it's large industry and so forth. It's cooling houses, and that's where we need to make sure that we have sort of also a tariff structure that is so price sensitive that we actually get the changes in the very, very short term. I think that there's more efficiency in those investments right now than there is in going out to the small households. Right.
My name is Mads Aarup. I'm an independent consultant within energy architecture and renewable energy. You had a previous slide with the potential of regulatory power, 1 point some gigawatts. Yeah, that one. Could you comment a little bit about the realizable potential of that? And what would be on your wish list to get this number up? Because I guess you want as much as this overall potential to be realizable.
Well, this is business-to-business potential. So this is not for the private market. This is actually for the companies and for the large-scale industry. But what we've seen here, and I hope that I don't drop out now when I go over here, this is sort of a best-case scenario. This is what we can get in the perfect world out of the business-to-business market in Denmark. Worst-case scenario is down here. And what we have in the middle is what EA Energianalyse and Energinet.dk have come up with as sort of realizable scenarios in the 2020 to 2030 perspective. What will we do to get there? Well, my favorite answer in these months is that that remains to be seen, but because that's actually exactly what we're looking at in what we call the afgifts- and tilskudsanalyse, which is coming online in May probably next year. So I can't go into sort of details and the instruments and what we're looking at there, but basically what I can say is what I said to the previous speaker was we're looking at ensuring that we have a tariff structure and economic incentives that are right to make sure that we have a market that reacts to price signals in the short term, very short term, and not to have sort of the day or the hourly market. We need to be able to use that capacity to balance even in seconds and minutes.
Kai Heusen, DTU, assistant professor here. You have talked about integrating more of demand response and helping balancing the grid when we have all this wind power. A lot of that demand and a lot of also businesses are in distribution grids. We've seen in Germany the solar development has impacted the distribution grids a lot. You as Danish Energy are representing a lot of distribution grid operators. So what is your strategy in direction and supporting that development on distribution grid side? I suppose there's some regulatory development in the discussions you mentioned before, but what other strategies are there? Is there some research development? You're doing this as Danish Energy directly, or how much do you see the research contributing there? Thank you.
I don't have a very clear answer for you. This is something that we're working very closely with Energinet.dk on analyzing, but what they tell me is that our distribution grid in Denmark is rock solid, that we've actually for many years over-invested in our distribution grid. I know that the utilities and the distributors are basically saying, no, well, in parts of the grid there are huge challenges, but the fact is that when we look at the core of the distribution grid, it's working very well. At least that's what the response I'm getting. I'm not an engineer, so I can't go in and check it myself, but that's the response I'm getting. And so when we need to work with private households in the future, we need to strengthen the distribution grid. We need to work with that. But in the short term, that's not a challenge as our analysts see it.
Final question.
What is short term? Because it's a fact that the large parts of the distribution grid was built in the 60s and 70s, and it doesn't last forever. Even if Energi.dk would like it to last forever, and we also would like it to last forever. It has to be renewed, and we need to reinvest in the distribution grid, even though it works good today.
Well, I think there has been reinvestments in the distribution grid. I think it is up to snuff right now. That's at least what I'm hearing. The question is, do we need to strengthen it further to make sure that we can actually encompass the demand response needed in the system? And that is, to answer your question, that is something we're looking at in the 2020 to 2030 perspective. So short term is before 2020. But we're also right now looking at the electricity regulation. There's an independent council that's been set down to look at that, to answer the question: is the electric or the power regulation in Denmark, is that meeting the requirements that we have for the system that we're trying to enter into? Do we have the right incentives in place for production, for distribution, etc.? And we're waiting for those very eagerly conclusions to come at the end of this month, beginning of December. Then we will go into a process where, as I said, at some point, we'll try to clean up the regulation and figure out how to make sure that the electricity regulation has a shape so that we will actually know that when we change one corner of the regulation, we don't get effects in other parts of the regulation that are unforeseen. Right?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Let's give Morten.
You're welcome.